Welcome to No Compromises, a peek into the mind of two old web devs who have seen some things. This is Joel.
And this is Aaron. I really hate magic strings. You know what I mean when I say magic strings or magic numbers?
Yeah, like abracadabra.
No. But like strings or numbers in our application that mean something. So like
Yes.
for example, like one ID one is a user, maybe -99 means something else, which is a horrible
Right.
thing to do.
Yeah.
Or like you have a status, a connection status, and it's the word good,
Okay.
or problem or something
Yeah,
like that. And so
it's something you're matching against in logic where it has a special meaning to it.
yeah, they're called
Yeah.
magic because they are strings, but they have a meaning. So that's the
Yes.
magic to it.
Okay.
And so in PHP for a long time, we didn't really have anything to do about that. I was really jealous of other languages when they started talking about things like enums, and we didn't have that. So what we did a lot of times is use constants,
Sure.
and you could define a constant in your runtime. But then I extended that, and I learned it from someone too, I'm sure. But like interfaces can have constants defined on them, so you could use an interface in PHP to define the properties or I'm sorry, to define the methods that a class needs to have, but you can also add constants onto it.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what I started with, is like, well, I'll have like for session keys, for example, a session
Okay.
key
Yeah.
contract, and it has all a bunch of public const, and that's all because that's the only way it's used, and that's how it's used. And that was really nice until we got what we were actually supposed to have, which was enums in PHP.
Yes.
So from a very high level, it just takes it one step further. It's a data structure that says I am a set of values. I'm only this set of values, and they mean something. And so in PHP, there's two different types. There's regular enums and there's string-backed enums. And based off that is how you set up the thing. So I'm gonna make some assumptions that our listeners kind of know what an enum is or can Google and stuff like that. So I don't want to get too much into that.
Or read the manual. There's a nice section
Right.
on enums. Yeah.
Right. My question comes more so down into a specific part of enums I wanted to talk with you about, Joel, because I've been using them more and more in my project. And I didn't have this problem with the interfaces because they didn't have as much flexibility.
Right.
But with enums, you can now add other stuff onto them besides just the values. You can add on methods. And so my question or my basis here is, how do you decide what methods to put on an enum, what methods even are valid or good on an enum, and how do you make sure you're not putting too much logic inside of a class that is really just meant to be like values?
Yeah. I've struggled with this as well. And can I throw a concrete example out because it might make
Yeah.
it easier to talk through? Like the one I think we probably reach for the most is like you have these. Let's say it's a string backed enum, and there's these strings, but like you want to say like maybe they're going to present them in a drop down list, and so the backed enum value isn't necessarily what you want to show to the user. So we might have like a method that's called labels or something where it converts the enum to like a human readable version. Is that like sort of what you're thinking about, or even broader than those sorts of things?
Yeah. I mean, that's a good example. That's a very simple one. So it might be that we have a public method called label.
Yeah.
And inside of there, it then looks at the current instance of itself. Because remember, I didn't say it was public static, I said it was public.
Yeah.
And so it looks at the current instance of itself, maybe runs a match and returns a string that, says this is the textual label.
Right.
Now, you could argue that since they're just string-backed enums, you could have the textual label as the value. So the key could be whatever you want to use in your code, and the value could be that. But I think where the label comes in is like when maybe the label is, I don't know, much larger than you want to store in your database, or you have a historical set of data that has keys and values. So like that's the one I run into a lot of times.
Or you want to translate it. I mean, there's other reasons too. Yeah.
Yeah, translation too. Yeah, whereas like it makes sense, but the client just wants to see it differently all the time.
Yeah. That's one example. And then maybe where it gets even. Well, let me just pause on that first, because that one, like you mentioned, you could just put it in the database. There's other solutions. I've seen another solution. I've never tried this, but like where somebody uses attributes on the enum cases for things like label. You could create like a label attribute, and then you can use reflection to get that stuff out of it. You're still putting logic in there, right? It's just maybe a different syntax or way of expressing it. But then there's
Yeah,
things,
that seems like wrapping of something we're just talking about. Like, oh, I don't want to write this method, so
yeah,
I'll just put attributes. And there's a method in the background somewhere because
right?
that doesn't just magically happen.
No,
So I'm not
no,
talking about bringing in packages even for our enums. What you're
no.
describing is a package, and so we can get to that. But
Okay.
that's not.
Yeah, but the other one that's maybe even fuzzier is like when there's logic. Like I can't remember the specific example, but I remember going through a code review with you where I had an enum that had to like we had to convert between two types of enums, and like what I had done worked and it was functional, but you're like, why is that method on this enum? I don't like it. Like we had to talk through it, and there was sort of the same thing. Is like, does this logic belong in the source enum, the target enum? Is it in like a different class altogether? And so sometimes it's convenient to put them by the enum, but it doesn't always feel the best architecturally.
Well, I think that there's probably again with all these things, it's there's never necessarily 100% rule, but there's this idea of what is the logical stuff that the enum has to do.
Yeah,
So, for example, when I might have a public static method on enum saying like blog, I can't think of from
sure.
post, right?
Okay.
And it gives me like a type of like an enum looking at that from the content.
Yeah.
And so as long as it doesn't have to do a query or reach in a database, if it's just
Mhm.
something structural where it's like I can pass in some data and that data legit like relatively tells me the enum that would represent that data, that's something some logic I'll put on that class, that
Yeah.
enum class. But if it's like doing queries and trying to convert stuff back and forth, I don't think like an enum should understand that it can do eloquent queries, for
I,
example.
I would agree with that. Yeah, that to me that would be crossing a line as well. Yeah, I'm on board with that.
So the question kind of is like, what are all these useful things? I'll give one other quick example because I think this
Okay.
is actually really useful. I've seen packages for this, but you don't need a package for this. It's kind of what you said with the
Mm.
enums for a dropdown. Sometimes you have an enum where all the cases need to be in a dropdown, and then they have to have their labels and stuff. So I've seen also like, static methods on enums saying like for select or something like that,
Oh, sure.
where it will go and take that and determine, like if you have a label method, it'll use that for the label. Otherwise, it'll use like the value and then put the key as the ID or like there's all kinds of different things you can do. And so
Yeah.
that's the other thing where I've seen where it sort of just takes the stuff, knowing kind of how you would use it all the time and sort of wraps it. And so it's not returning HTML, it's not returning anything like that. It's just
Yeah.
returning a different data structure that happens to work for Slex.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't dabbled with that, but I could see how that could be useful, especially if you're doing it a bunch of times and don't want to repeat these methods all over the place.
Well, you have dabbled with it, you just don't remember. Like for example, I'll give you an example.
Okay.
We use Mary UI in some of our
Oh,
projects.
yeah, yeah.
And so some of our enums there, we're using X choices offline now or whatever. And so we want to get those values out of those enums. And so we made a method that was like for Mary UI
Right.
choices or something
Yeah.
like that.
But not a
Only
package.
because, yeah. Only because it was also very specific. Like they wanted specific keys, not like a
Yes.
key value. It was an array with two keys and stuff
Yeah.
like that. And so those are known data structures. Again,
Mhm.
maybe it's data structure. It's not necessarily the content afterwards. So that's a good idea. Since enums technically are a data structure, they should be able to work with and create and manage other data structures, but not necessarily manage or create or work with other data.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. I think especially once it crosses the line into dealing with other types of data, especially if it's like an eloquent model or something like that, that's where it feels more like you're kind of bending this. You're expanding the scope of what an enum should do. But yeah, if it's just purely data manipulation, I think content is part of that. If you're just mapping like from a backing value to a user readable value, or more complicated, like into a different data structure, but it's the same basic data. I have no problem with that. I mean, we have done it, so of course it's okay because we wouldn't do something if it was wrong.
I think the whole, whether it uses eloquent or whatever is also like a judgment call too,
Yeah,
because I can see two different ways. Like we don't make that a hard fast rule, but I don't want it to query eloquent. But
yeah.
for an incoming parameter value, should it be able to understand a model? I don't know. Maybe because maybe it needs
Okay.
something like maybe it's like give me this enum from these two models or something, and those are all hydrated and they have their properties, and then based off that, I'm just thinking theoretically here. But I don't know if it's so hard of a seam saying like, well, it can never use Eloquent. It can't do Eloquent queries.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, and then I would be like, I wonder if a cast is the solution instead for some of those translation things. Like you could still, that logic is on the model and it returns an enum, and then the cast contains the logic to get from the model to the enum. But yeah, some of those are judgment calls based on the project and the complexity of the logic.
So I think the whole wrapping around point here is that you can put methods on your enums, but don't use it as like just another helper class or like another, God class or service. It's
stuff.
They should be specifically targeted to the data structures and retrieving and showing the data in those data structures. I don't know if I'm weird, but I have a personal boundary or a personal bubble that I don't want people inside of. Like I live a more of a suburban life, so I don't have to go on to the subway. I'm not bumping into people all the time. They're not just touching me. And so I'm a little
physical bubble, isn't that emotional bubble?
Okay. Yeah, physical bubble. Like stay out of my personal space, bro.
Got it.
And so I guess not everyone has this. Because recently I was somewhere in a meeting and someone was like sitting a couple of chairs away from me and then got up and sat right next to me and was touching my arm even during the meeting. Like not like
technical foul.
Well, not like touching my arm, like, oh, like interesting conversation. It's like we were both staring forward, interested in the meeting concept, but there was like a chair between us, and then they just got up and sat right next to me. No mention of why. No mention of why you're so close and touching me. My assumption is that the chair was like wonky or something, but swap the chair then. Don't just come sit next to me and touch me.
I'm with you 100%, man. Like that would just, can I ask how you responded? Did you like just grin and bear it, or did you move over?
Well, there wasn't anywhere else to move over. I was already on like the aisle seat. So I guess I could have moved into the aisle. I just kind of stared forward and just, wondered about this person next to me. I initially went angry, right? Because I'm a fighter and I go angry. But then I was like, that's weird. Like, I don't think this person's a psychopath. So I was more like just interested in that concept then for the rest of the meeting. I was like, because it was the entire time and still touching me. I was like, what is it? What possibly is happening? So I'd like move over just a tiny bit and like no touching. And so then I straighten my back, touching me again. Like, what? I guess you could say like, well, you found a way not to be touching, so you should have moved over. But no, I was there first, Joel.
Yeah.
We can just solve everything by saying, yeah, accept all edits and changes from Claude or Copilot, but there might be a better way to do this too.
If you'd like someone on your team that actually thinks through the decisions while still using the efficient tools that AI gives us, head over to nocompromises.io and see how we can work with your team.